The morning they came to take everything Adelaide Garner had ever known, the sky over Dusty Creek, Texas was the color of a fresh bruise, and she stood in her father's doorway with her hands balled into fists at her sides, refusing to cry. It was the autumn of 1882, and the land her father Thomas Garner had carved out of the Texas hill country over 30 hard years lay golden, and vast under that bruised sky, 340 acres of cattle range, creek bottom and limestone pasture that smelled like cedar and dry grass, and everything Adelaide had ever loved. Thomas Garner had died 6 weeks prior, quietly, in the bed where he had slept alone since Adelaide's mother passed a decade before him. He had died holding Adelaide's hand and telling her the land was hers, that he had always meant it to be hers, that she was the one who knew every fence post and watering hole by heart. He had said it as though saying it were enough. He had not counted on his brother. Raymond Garner arrived in Dusty Creek 2 days after the burial, riding a fine bay horse and wearing a town suit that still had the dust of San Antonio on it. He was Thomas's younger brother by 12 years, a man who had left the hill country at 18 and made himself into something between a land speculator and a saloon investor in the city, a man who smelled of pomade and opportunity. He came with a lawyer named Chester Pratt, whose collar was always damp with perspiration, and whose smile never quite reached his small gray eyes. Together they presented a document to the county courthouse, claiming that Adelaide, being an unmarried woman of 23 years, was unfit and legally insufficient to inherit and manage the Garner ranch, and that the estate ought to pass to Raymond as the sole male heir of Thomas Garner's bloodline. Adelaide had read that document 3 times in the cold lamplight of the kitchen, where her father used to drink his morning coffee, and each time she read it the fury rose higher in her chest, until it sat just below her throat like a burning coal. She was not uneducated. Her father had made sure of that, ordering books from back east, sitting with her at this very table to work through accounts and ledgers and contracts. She understood every word of that document, and she understood what it meant. Raymond and Chester Pratt meant to use the law the way some men used a brand iron, to mark something as theirs regardless of what it had been before. She hired a lawyer in town, a tired old man named Frederick Hull who drank too much rye whiskey and whose office smelled like old paper and regret. Frederick Hull told her plainly that the case was difficult, that the law in Texas in 1882 was not written with women like her in mind, that a judge might very well side with Raymond on the grounds of custom and precedent alone. He told her this with genuine sorrow, which she appreciated, even as she wanted to throw his inkwell through his window. The hearing was set for the 2nd week of November, which gave Adelaide 31 days to find a way to save her father's land. It was during those 31 days that Jonas Hale rode into Dusty Creek. He came from the north, from a cattle drive that had ended badly outside of Abilene, the herd sold at a loss due to a fever that had swept through the stock and taken 1/3 of the cattle before the drovers could get them to market. Jonas had ridden south afterward without much of a plan, which was not unusual for him. He was 27 years old, tall, with brown hair that wanted cutting and eyes the color of creek water under shade, a kind of shifting gray-green that changed with the light. He had a good horse, a roan mare named Calico who had more sense than half the men he had worked alongside, and he had enough money in his vest pocket to last him 3 weeks if he was careful and 2 weeks if he was not. He came to Dusty Creek because he had heard they were hiring hands at the Garner Ranch. Word passed along the trail from a cowboy who had worked there the previous spring and spoken well of the place. What that cowboy had not mentioned was that the ranch was presently in the middle of a legal dispute, and that the woman running it was doing so alone, with 3 remaining ranch hands who were loyal but aging, and a worry in her brown eyes that she was working very hard to keep off her face. Adelaide met Jonas Hale at the gate to the ranch yard on a Tuesday morning when the frost was still on the fence rails, and the horses were blowing white breath in the cold air. She had been mending a section of fence herself because one of her hands, old Clem, had a bad back that week, and she was not the kind of woman who waited for things to get done on their own. She had a hammer in one hand and a nail between her teeth, and she pulled the nail out and looked at this stranger on his roan horse with the flat, measuring look of a person who had learned not to trust the easy arrival of things. "You the one who posted wanting a hand?" Jonas said, pulling his hat brim up to look at her properly. "I am," Adelaide said. "Though I should tell you straight off that the situation here is complicated, and I may not be able to pay you past the new year depending on how a certain legal matter resolves." Jonas considered this. "What kind of legal matter?" "The kind where my dead father's brother is trying to take this ranch out from under me," Adelaide said, which was more than she had intended to say to a stranger in the first 5 minutes, but something about the directness of his gaze had pulled it out of her before she could measure it. Jonas was quiet for a moment. He looked out over the land, the limestone hills running along the south, the creek threading silver through the lower pasture, the cattle spread across the middle ground like pieces on a board game. He looked back at her. "What do you need doing?" he said. She hired him that morning. In the days that followed, Adelaide learned several things about Jonas Hale. She learned that he was a careful worker, not the fastest, but thorough, the kind of man who did a job the right way the first time so he would not have to do it twice. She learned that he was quiet in the evenings, not unfriendly but self-contained, sitting on the bunkhouse step with a cup of coffee and looking at the dark hills as though they had something to tell him. She learned that he had grown up on a small ranch in Kansas that had been sold off when his father died young and his mother could not keep it going, and that there was something in the way he walked across her pastures, carefully, as though respecting the ground underfoot, that told her he understood what land meant to a person, what it cost, what it was worth. She also learned, in the way that women of the frontier learn such things without quite admitting they are learning them, that Jonas Hale had a laugh that arrived rarely and completely, that it transformed his face from serious into something open and warm, and that she found herself saying things that she judged might produce this effect more often than was strictly necessary for the running of a cattle operation. He learned things about her too. He learned that she was up before the dawn every single morning, that she knew the name and history of every animal on the property, that she could read a cattle ledger with the same precision she applied to everything else she did. He learned that she had strong opinions about how fence lines ought to run and was not shy about expressing them. He learned that she heated her coffee in the evenings and drank it on the porch looking south, and that if he happened to be passing by with some task or another, she would pour a second cup without asking whether he wanted one, as though she had simply decided on his behalf. He did not mind this. He found that he walked past the porch in the evenings more often than the task at hand required. It was the 3rd week of his employment, with the hearing only 11 days away, when things between them shifted in the way that they sometimes do between two people who have been careful with each other for reasons that are becoming harder to remember. It was a Saturday evening, and Adelaide had been going through her father's papers at the kitchen table for the 3rd time that week, looking for anything that might help Frederick Hull construct a better argument. The lamp was burning low and she had her hair loose, which she would not have permitted if she had been expecting company, and when Jonas knocked at the kitchen door with a question about the morning's work schedule, she called for him to come in without thinking about it, because she had been alone in that kitchen with her father for so many years that having another person in it had started to feel natural. Jonas came in and stopped when he saw the papers spread across the table, the ledgers and the deeds and the old letters, and the look on Adelaide's face which was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "No luck," he said. "There is a letter," she said, and pushed it across the table toward him. "Written in my father's hand 3 years ago to Frederick Hull. It says plainly that he intended this land to come to me, that he considered me his heir and his successor, that he had no intention of the property passing anywhere else." She paused. Mr. Hull says it may not be enough because it was never formalized into a proper will. Jonas sat down across from her without being invited, which would have annoyed her if someone else had done it, but did not annoy her when he did it. He read the letter carefully. "Your father wrote a fine hand," he said. "He was a careful man," Adelaide said. "He believed in doing things right." Her voice caught slightly on the last word and she pressed her lips together. "He believed in you," Jonas said, and he said it simply, without decoration, and Adelaide looked up at him across the lamplight, and something in the architecture of her self-possession came slightly undone. "He did," she said, "which is why I cannot let Raymond Garner walk away with this land. I cannot let my father's belief in me amount to nothing." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. One of those silences that had grown up between them over 3 weeks of working and eating and living in close proximity on a working cattle ranch. Jonas was looking at the letter still, but his expression had changed from thoughtful to something more decided. "I would like to come to the hearing," he said, "if you will permit it." "Why?" Adelaide said. "Because I have been working this land for 3 weeks," he said, "and I have seen how you run it. I have seen what you know and what you do and how your hands look at you when you give an order. I think a judge might want to hear from someone who has seen that firsthand." He paused. "I think you deserve someone in that room who is on your side." Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. The lamp guttered slightly in a draft from the window. "You barely know me," she said. "I know you well enough," Jonas said. She did not argue with this. She discovered that she did not want to. The days between that evening and the hearing were busy in the practical ways that days on a working ranch are always busy: cattle to move, fences to check, feed to arrange for the coming winter, and busy too in the way that Adelaide had not been accustomed to, which was the business of two people becoming increasingly aware of each other in a way that had nothing to do with cattle or fences or feed. Jonas rode out with her on the Thursday before the hearing to check the creek bottom, where she had been concerned about the fence line along the property boundary. It was a cold day with a white sky, and their breath came in clouds as they rode, and the horses moved easily through the dry grass that rustled at their knees. Adelaide showed him the boundary line her father had set, following the natural curve of the creek, and she told him the history of it, how Thomas Garner had negotiated the exact placement with the neighboring landowner 30 years ago, how the creek had shifted slightly since, and the fence needed to be adjusted to account for it. She talked about the land with a fluency and a love that was as natural as breathing, and Jonas rode beside her and listened and watched her face while she spoke and understood several things about himself that he had not been certain of before. He pulled Calico to a stop on a low rise above the creek and looked down at the winter pasture below them, the brown grass and the silver water and the limestone bluffs above it all, and he said, "It is a beautiful piece of country." Adelaide pulled up her own horse and looked at it too, as though reminding herself, as though she needed to see it again with someone else's eyes to understand what she was fighting for. "Yes," she said, "it is." They stayed on that rise for a few minutes longer than was necessary, in the particular way that people stay in places when they do not quite want to leave them. Adelaide's horse shifted, and their knees nearly touched, and neither of them moved away. The cold wind came off the hills and pushed a strand of Adelaide's hair across her cheek, and Jonas reached out without quite deciding to and pushed it back, his finger barely grazing her cheekbone, and then they both became very interested in looking at the middle distance. "We should get back," Adelaide said. "Yes," Jonas agreed, and they turned their horses, and neither of them said anything else for most of the ride back. But the silence was different from the silences before. The night before the hearing, Adelaide could not sleep. She lay in her bed in her father's house listening to the dark ranch breathe around her, the cattle moving in the lower pasture, the wind in the cedar trees, the occasional sound of one of the horses shifting in the barn. She had lain in this same bed through many difficult nights before, through the night her mother died, through the nights in the first months after when her father had sat in the kitchen unable to sleep himself, and she had lain here listening to him, and knowing there was nothing she could do. She had always been good at lying still in difficult dark hours. But tonight the stillness was harder, because tomorrow Frederick Hull would stand before Judge Clement Ware in the Dusty Creek courthouse and argue that a dead man's letter of intent was sufficient to establish Adelaide's right to her father's land, and Chester Pratt would stand on the other side of the aisle and argue that it was not, and the outcome of that argument would determine what the rest of Adelaide's life looked like. She thought about Jonas. She thought about what it had meant that he had offered, without her asking, to come. She thought about the warmth of his presence in her father's kitchen and on her father's land, and she thought about how frightening it was that in 31 days she had come to depend on something she had not expected. Then she thought about the land, and her father's face when he had held her hand and said it was hers, and she made herself stop being frightened. The courthouse in Dusty Creek was a single-story limestone building on the main street between the telegraph office and the general store, with a wooden floor that creaked underfoot and windows that let in a thin November light. Frederick Hull had told Adelaide to dress simply and to bring any documentation she had. She wore her good dark dress and her mother's brooch, and she carried the letter and the ledgers and the deed of original purchase in a leather satchel her father had given her the year she turned 18. Raymond Garner was already there when Adelaide arrived, seated on the right side of the aisle with Chester Pratt beside him, and another man Adelaide did not know, who had the look of a witness brought in for the purpose. Raymond looked at Adelaide when she entered and gave her a smile that was sorry and superior in equal measure, the smile of a man who believed he had already won and was being gracious about it. Adelaide sat down on the left side with Frederick Hull and opened her satchel and set her documents on the table in front of her with the steady, deliberate movements of a person who has decided on composure. Jonas came in and sat in the gallery behind her, and when she turned to acknowledge him, his eyes met hers with a steadiness that she held onto the way you hold onto a fence rail in a wind. Judge Clement Ware was a large man with white hair and the patient, seen-everything expression of a man who had been presiding over the business of human beings for a long time. He read through the relevant documents first, the petition from Raymond and Pratt, the deed, the census records, the letter from Thomas Garner. He asked several clarifying questions in the flat, procedural tone of someone who wanted the facts before he wanted the arguments. Then he let Chester Pratt speak. Pratt was smooth. Adelaide had expected this. He spoke about the nature of land management, about the complexity of cattle operations, about the legal standing of female inheritors under Texas property law in 1882, which was as limited as Pratt needed it to be for his purposes. He spoke about Raymond Garner's experience in business and his fitness as an heir. He brought forward his witness, a man named Sullivan who operated a neighboring ranch and who testified, with the careful vagueness of someone who has been coached, that he had concerns about the ranch's management in recent weeks and felt that a steady male hand was needed at the helm. Adelaide kept her face still through all of this. She kept her hands flat on the table. She watched Judge Ware's face for any sign of which way the river was running. Frederick Hull spoke next, and he was less polished than Pratt but more sincere, and sincerity counts for something even in a courthouse in 1882. He presented the letter from Thomas Garner and read it aloud, and the words filled the room with Thomas's careful, precise voice, and Adelaide felt the burning coal rise in her throat again and refused to let it go any further than that. Hull argued that intent was the substance of the law and that intent was clearly demonstrated here. He presented the ledgers in Adelaide's hand and explained what they showed about her management of the accounts. He was building a case with old bricks and good mortar, and Adelaide watched Judge Ware's face and thought it might be enough, barely enough, possibly enough. Then Chester Pratt stood up for his rebuttal and began to take it apart. He questioned the authenticity of the letter's intent. He raised the issue of the letter never having been filed with the court or witnessed by a notary. He pointed out that Thomas Garner had lived 3 years after writing that letter without formalizing it into a will, and suggested that this indicated uncertainty on Thomas's part about whether Adelaide was truly the right choice. He was careful and thorough and merciless in the way that good lawyers are merciless, and with each sentence Adelaide felt the ground shift slightly under her feet. Judge Ware was making notes. He had the look of a man reaching a conclusion, and it was not a look that made Adelaide's heart easy. And then Jonas Hale stood up from his seat in the gallery. "Your Honor," Jonas said, and his voice was clear and unhurried and carried to every corner of the room in the way that voices do when they are completely certain of what they are saying. "If the court would permit a witness not previously announced, I would like to say something." Judge Ware looked up. Chester Pratt turned with an expression of controlled irritation. Raymond Garner's smile went slightly rigid at the edges. "And who are you?" the judge said. "My name is Jonas Hale," he said. "I am a ranch hand currently employed at the Garner property. I have been working for Adelaide Garner for 3 weeks, and I would like to respectfully disagree with the characterization of her fitness to manage this land." Frederick Hull, to his credit, was on his feet in an instant, requesting that the court permit the testimony. Judge Ware looked at Jonas for a long moment and then looked at Pratt and said, "I will hear him." Chester Pratt sat down with the controlled displeasure of a man who knows he cannot prevent a thing and is deciding how to deal with it. Jonas stepped forward and stood before the judge's bench and spoke without notes or preparation, the way a man speaks when he is simply saying what is true. He said that in 3 weeks of working alongside Adelaide Garner, he had watched her manage a complex cattle operation with knowledge and judgment that he had rarely seen matched in 27 years of ranch life. He said he had seen her make decisions about herd health and pasture rotation and winter feed preparation that demonstrated a thorough understanding of the land and its needs. He said he had seen her read a ledger with precision and negotiate with a supply merchant in town with authority. He said that the neighboring rancher Sullivan's testimony about concerns with recent management was puzzling to him, because what he had seen in the same period was a ranch being run with skill and care by a woman who had learned every aspect of it from her father across 23 years. He said that the question of whether Adelaide Garner was fit to inherit her father's land was, in his professional judgment as a man who had spent his adult life in the cattle trade, not a question at all. He said that Thomas Garner had known what he was doing when he told his daughter that land was hers, and he said that he respectfully disagreed with the implication that a woman knowing a piece of land better than anyone alive was somehow an argument against her inheriting it. He said all of this looking at Judge Ware, but once, near the end, his eyes moved briefly to Adelaide, and the look in them was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The courtroom was quiet when he finished. The November light came through the windows and lay in pale rectangles on the creaking floor. Adelaide had her hands clasped together on the table in front of her, and she was looking at Jonas, and she was not entirely certain what was happening in the region of her chest, but it was something considerable. Chester Pratt attempted a cross-examination, and it did not go well for him. Jonas answered every question with the same calm directness with which he had spoken originally, and the more Pratt pushed the clearer it became that this was a man who was simply telling the truth and could not be shaken from it, because there was nothing in it to shake. Judge Ware called a recess. Adelaide stepped outside into the cold November air and stood against the courthouse wall and let herself breathe. Frederick Hull came out and patted her arm and said he thought it was looking better. Raymond and Chester Pratt walked past on the opposite side of the street without acknowledging her, which told her more than their words would have. Jonas came out and stood beside her, and they were quiet for a moment. "You did not have to do that," Adelaide said. "I know," he said. "Why did you?" He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was very direct and very simple, the way the best things often are. "Because it was true," he said, "and because someone needed to say it." Adelaide looked away down the street, at the town going about its business in the pale winter light, and she felt something she had been holding very tightly, for 6 weeks, since her father died, for 31 days since Raymond arrived, for years maybe before that of managing everything alone and making it look effortless. She felt it begin, slowly and with some resistance, to ease. Judge Ware came back after an hour and delivered his ruling. He said that the letter from Thomas Garner demonstrated clear and unambiguous intent that was not negated by the absence of formal notarization, that the court was satisfied that Thomas Garner had understood his wishes and communicated them plainly. He said that the testimony provided, both the documented evidence of the ledgers and the first-hand account of Jonas Hale, supported the conclusion that Adelaide Garner was fully capable of managing the Garner estate. He ruled in favor of Adelaide. The land was hers. Raymond Garner left the courthouse without speaking to her. Chester Pratt followed him, gathering his papers with the clipped efficiency of a man recalibrating for the next opportunity. They rode out of Dusty Creek together the following morning, and Adelaide watched them go from the gate of the ranch yard with a feeling that was not triumph. Exactly, because the cost of the last 6 weeks was too high for anything to feel like pure triumph, but was solid and warm and real in the way that things are when they are right. Frederick Hull shook her hand and told her she was a remarkable young woman, and she thanked him sincerely. Old Clem and the other 2 hands, Bert and a young man named Will, who had only been with the ranch since summer, raised a modest celebration in the bunkhouse that evening with a bottle of whiskey that Bert had been saving for a good occasion, and Adelaide sat with them for a while and accepted a small measure of whiskey in a tin cup and listened to them talk, and felt the ranch around her like a familiar coat. Jonas was quiet that evening. He sat on the bunkhouse step after the others went inside, and Adelaide, walking back toward the house, stopped at a little distance from him. "You should come inside and have some whiskey with the others," she said. "I had some," he said. "I am all right here." Adelaide looked at him in the cold dark, his long frame folded on the step, looking up at the stars that were very brilliant and numerous over the Texas hills on a clear, cold night. "You saved this ranch today," she said. "You saved this ranch today," Jonas said. "I just agreed with what was already true." She sat down on the step beside him, which she had not quite planned to do, but which felt like the natural continuation of something that had been moving in this direction for some time. They were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold air. Above them, the stars continued their vast and indifferent business. "What will you do now?" Adelaide said, "I mean in general, not just tonight." Jonas was quiet for a moment, looking at the hills. "I had not thought much past getting to the next job," he said. "That has been the way of it for a while, since my father's place was sold." He paused. "I had forgotten, I think, what it was like to be somewhere that felt like a place." Adelaide heard the weight in that and did not try to lighten it. She just sat with it. "This is a good place," she said. "Yes," Jonas said. "It is." There was a long silence, not uncomfortable, the kind that has something building inside it. "I would like to offer you a permanent position," Adelaide said carefully, "if you wanted it. The ranch needs a foreman properly, not just hands, and you know cattle and you know this land now, and you are good at the work." Jonas turned his head to look at her. In the starlight his eyes were very dark. "A foreman," he said. "To start," Adelaide said, and then stopped, because she was not entirely sure what she had meant by that and was not ready to be sure. Not tonight, not yet. Jonas looked at her for a long moment in which Adelaide held perfectly still. "I would be glad to accept that," he said. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. "Good," she said. "That is good." She went inside shortly after, but she did not sleep for some time, lying in the dark listening to the ranch breathe around her. And this time it was a different kind of wakefulness. The winter came in earnest through December and January, bringing cold nights and the particular focused work of keeping cattle through the hard season, breaking ice on the water troughs each morning, managing the winter feed supplies, watching the sky for weather. Jonas settled into the ranch with the ease of a man who has found something that fits him, and Adelaide found herself trusting his judgment in the way that she trusted her own, which she did not do lightly, and which meant something considerable. They worked alongside each other with a comfortable, practical intimacy that was one of the most honest things Adelaide had ever experienced. There was no performance in it. They argued sometimes about practical things, the placement of a new water trough, the timing of a particular sale, and these arguments were direct and productive, and usually ended with both of them having contributed something to the outcome. Adelaide found that she liked arguing with someone who took her thinking seriously enough to push back against it. She had not known before how rare this was. In the evenings they sat on the porch when the cold permitted it, with coffee, and talked. They talked about the ranch and the cattle, but they also talked about other things. About the books Adelaide had read and Jonas had read fewer of but was curious about the changes coming to Texas, the railroads expanding and the old open range closing, about what they had each hoped for when they were younger, and what they thought of those hopes now. Jonas talked about his father's ranch in Kansas with a quiet grief that Adelaide recognized. She talked about her mother with the same kind of grief. They traded these griefs without drama or self-pity, and found that the trading made them lighter. It was in February, on a Sunday when the other hands were in town and the ranch was very quiet, and the hill country had the particular still beauty it takes on after a light frost, that Jonas kissed Adelaide. They had been walking the south fence line together, a job that did not strictly require both of them but that neither of them had questioned the assignment of. The morning was white and cold, and their breath came in long, slow clouds, and the cedar trees stood very green against the pale sky. They were talking about the spring schedule, about which pastures to open first when the grass came back, and Adelaide was making a point about the south meadow that Jonas was listening to with the focused attention he gave to things that interested him, which was the same attention he gave to her when she talked about the ranch, when she realized they had stopped walking and were standing facing each other on the frost-stiff grass, and that Jonas was not looking at the south meadow but at her face, and that he had been looking at her face for a while. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. Jonas said her name, Adelaide, quietly, as though testing it, and then he reached up and touched her cheek with his cold hand, and she did not move, and he leaned in slowly enough that she could have moved if she had wanted to, and she did not want to, and he kissed her. It was cold and careful, and then it was warm and not careful at all, and Adelaide felt the coal that had been burning under her breastbone since November transform into something altogether different and considerably more comfortable. When they separated, there was a moment in which the frost and the cedar trees and the winter pasture existed in sharp and luminous detail around them. "I have been meaning to do that for some time," Jonas said. "I know," Adelaide said. He looked at her. "Did you mean to let me?" "I know," she said again, and this time she was smiling. He laughed, that rare full laugh that opened his face, and she was very glad to have produced it, and they walked back to the ranch together in the white winter morning with the particular lightness of two people who have stopped pretending something is not true. The spring came quickly that year, the way it does in the Texas hill country, the grass going from nothing to green in what felt like a matter of days, the cattle spreading out into the pastures with relieved purpose, the air warming and smelling of cedar bloom and creek water and turned earth. The ranch came alive again in the way that working land comes alive in spring, busy and purposeful, and full of small daily satisfactions. Adelaide and Jonas worked together with the ease of people who have long since decided on each other, though they had not yet had all the words of that deciding out loud. It lived between them in the evenings on the porch, and in the mornings when Jonas brought 2 cups of coffee to the kitchen table as naturally as though he had always done so, and in the way he looked at her across the supper table with old Clem and Bert and Will, a look that contained a private understanding that was entirely theirs. She told him about her mother one evening in April, sitting on the porch with the spring dark warm around them, told him things she had not told anyone because there had not been anyone to tell. She told him how her mother had been the kind of woman who noticed everything, who could read weather in the color of the morning sky and read a person's heart in the first 3 words they spoke, and how Adelaide had spent her whole life trying to become a woman her mother would have recognized as someone worthwhile. Jonas listened to all of this without interrupting and without filling the space after she finished with reassurance. Just let it be said and true, which was exactly the right thing. She would have been proud, he said after a while, not because you saved the ranch, because of who you are while you do everything. Adelaide looked at him in the warm dark for a long moment. I think, she said carefully, that I am in love with you. The words arrived in the air between them with the pleasant shock of a cool wind on a hot day. Jonas was quiet for a moment, and then he turned to look at her, and the look in his creekwater eyes was so plain and sure and undefended that it made something in Adelaide's chest turn over. I have been in love with you, he said, since the day you were standing at the fence gate with a hammer and a nail between your teeth and you looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth your time. Adelaide laughed. And what did you decide? I decided I wanted very much for you to decide I was, he said. She reached across and took his hand where it rested on the porch rail, and they sat like that for a while in the warm April dark while the cattle moved in the lower pasture, and the stars came out over the hills. It was 2 weeks after this, on a Thursday in May with the bluebonnets running purple and blue along the creek bottoms, and the ranch in full spring operation, that Jonas asked Adelaide to marry him. He did not do it with ceremony or theater. They were riding back from the north pasture in the late afternoon, the sun going gold and heavy over the limestone hills, and Jonas pulled Calico to a stop and looked at Adelaide beside him on her gray mare, and said what he had been turning over in his mind for some time, which was that he wanted to spend his life on this land with her, and he would very much like to know whether she wanted the same thing. Adelaide looked at him for a long moment, and the gold light was on both their faces, and the bluebonnets were along the creek below them, and the ranch spread out behind them in the long afternoon light. And she said yes with a steadiness and certainty that matched exactly what she felt. He leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her, and Calico shifted impatiently, and Adelaide laughed against his mouth. They were married in June of 1883 in the small church in Dusty Creek on a morning when the air smelled of cedar and wildflowers, and the Texas summer was just beginning to announce itself. Adelaide wore her mother's good dress that she had taken in slightly at the waist, and her hair was done up by the minister's wife who had a kindly manner and a sure hand with hairpins. Old Clem cried without any attempt at concealing it, which everyone pretended not to notice. Bert and Will stood in the gallery. Frederick Hull came, looking somewhat less weary than usual. Several neighbors attended, people who had known Thomas Garner and were glad to see the ranch continuing. Jonas stood at the front of the church in a clean shirt, and his good vest with his hair cut and his eyes very steady on Adelaide as she came up the aisle, and she looked at him looking at her, and thought that 31 days before the hearing she had stood in her father's doorway looking at a bruised sky, and had not known any of this was coming, and was very glad that it had. The minister read them the words and they said the words back, and it was simple and true and complete in the way that the best moments are. They rode back to the ranch together after the small celebration at the church, through the June afternoon with the hills golden around them and the summer beginning its long warm hold on the country. And when they came to the gate of the ranch yard, Jonas swung down from Calico and held Adelaide's mare while she dismounted, and then he held her hand as they walked into the ranch yard together, and he did not let go. The summer unfolded. The cattle business was good that year, the prices better than the previous season, and Jonas had a careful eye for the market and good instincts about when to hold and when to sell, and Adelaide had the ledgers and the long view, and together they made a better business than either would have made alone. The ranch grew stronger through the summer and into the fall, and Adelaide hired a fourth hand, a young man from a valley ranch who was good with horses, and the operation settled into a new shape that had more capacity in it. They were happy in the practical, daily way that is the best kind of happiness, the kind that does not require continuous maintenance because it is built into the structure of the life itself. It was in the mornings and the evenings and the work and the arguments and the particular pleasure of lying in bed at night with the hill country dark and quiet outside and Jonas's steady breathing beside her, and the knowledge that tomorrow the ranch would need them both, and that this was not a burden but the shape of everything she had wanted. In October, Adelaide told Jonas that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen early before the others were up, with the coffee just made and the dawn coming pale through the east window. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything, watching his face while she said it. Jonas put down his coffee cup very carefully and then stood up and came around the table and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she had no word for but which she understood completely. "Adelaide," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her forehead and held her against him, and she could feel his heartbeat, quick and then steadying. And they stood like that in the kitchen while the dawn came fully through the window, and the ranch began to wake up around them. Old Clem, when he was told, cried again, which nobody was surprised by. The pregnancy proceeded through the fall and winter with the straightforward progression of a healthy young woman who had never in her life been given to unnecessary fragility. Adelaide continued her work in modified form, giving up the longer writing as the winter progressed, but managing the books and the household operations with unchanged attention. Jonas watched her with a new quality of care that she found both touching and occasionally excessive, and she told him so, and he acknowledged it and continued to exhibit it anyway, which she also found touching. They talked about the child in the evenings, about names and about what they hoped for. They talked about what it would mean to raise a child on this land, to pass it on the right way, with the child knowing it and loving it the way Adelaide had known and loved it, the way her father had always intended. They talked about Thomas Garner and what he would have thought of all of this, and Adelaide believed she knew exactly what he would have thought, which was that it was exactly right. Their son was born in the early spring of 1884, on a March morning when the hill country was just beginning its slow turn back toward warmth, with the first green coming into the grass and the creek running high with winter melt. The birth was attended by the doctor from Dusty Creek and by the minister's wife, who had excellent practical skills and a calm manner that Adelaide valued more than she could say. Jonas stayed as close as the doctor would permit and paced the porch for the parts he could not be present for with an anxiety that Will and Bert watched with some amusement from a respectful distance. The boy was healthy and loud and had Jonas's coloring, the brown hair and the shifting gray-green eyes, though Adelaide's expression, that serious, evaluating look that had so struck Jonas on the first morning. They named him Thomas Jonas Hale, for Adelaide's father, and when Jonas held him for the first time in the kitchen of the ranch house, with the March morning coming through the windows and Adelaide watching from the bed, they had moved downstairs for the duration. Jonas's face had the same unguarded look it had worn in the church, and Adelaide thought that her father would have been very proud of this, and that she was very glad to be alive in this particular moment of the world. Thomas grew the way ranch children grow, surrounded by land and animals and the daily business of real work, curious and independent and not easily frightened. He could ride by the time he was 4 with the natural ease of a child who has been watching riders his whole life. He had his mother's precision with numbers and his father's patience with difficult tasks. He collected things, rocks, feathers, the shells of strange beetles he found in the cedar breaks, each one catalogued in a method that was entirely his own and absolutely logical to him. The ranch continued to grow through those years. Jonas brought new knowledge to the cattle operation, a better understanding of breed management he had picked up from ranchers further north, and Adelaide's attention to the books and the business relationships with the buyers and the bankers kept the margins sound. They added a new section to the barn in 1885 and improved the water system in 1886, running pipe from the upper creek to 3 new troughs that saved the hands an hour of work each morning. The Garner Ranch, which Thomas Garner had built by himself over 30 years, was becoming something larger and more solid under his daughter's hands, and there was a satisfaction in this that Adelaide carried quietly and continually. She did not forget the courthouse. She did not forget what it had cost, those 31 days, the letter and the ledgers and Frederick Hull's old tired competence and Jonas standing up in the gallery and saying he disagreed. She did not forget because she did not want to forget, because remembering it was part of what she was building against. She was aware of what the law had tried to do to her, and of how narrowly it had been prevented, and she was aware that there were women all over the Texas Hill Country, and beyond it, who had not had a Jonas Hale to stand up in a courtroom for them, and that this was a fact in the world she lived in that she was not able to fix, but was not able to ignore either. She talked about this with Jonas on the evenings when Thomas was asleep and the ranch was quiet, talked about it with the same directness she brought to everything, and Jonas listened and agreed with the same straightforwardness he brought to everything, which was one of the things she loved most about him, that there was no careful management of her thinking required, that she could simply say a true thing and it would be received as a true thing. "The law is slow," Jonas said once, on a winter evening in 1886 with the fire good in the kitchen stove and Thomas's sleeping breath audible from the next room. "But it moves, and people who push against it matter, even the small pushings." "I know," Adelaide said. "I just would like the small pushings to add up faster." "They will," he said. "Not in our time, maybe, but Thomas's children will know something different." Adelaide thought about this. "Thomas's children," she said, and looked at Jonas with a particular look that she had developed for particular conversations. Jonas looked back at her. "Are you telling me something?" he said. "I may be," she said. Their daughter arrived in September of 1887, small and dark-haired and immediately sure of herself, in the way that some children are from the very first hour. They named her Margaret Clara Hale, for Jonas's mother whose name was Margaret, and for Adelaide's mother whose middle name had been Clara, and the naming felt right in the way that things feel right when they honor the people who made it possible for you to be who you are. Margaret was different from Thomas in most of the ways that a girl child differs from a boy child in temperament and interest, though some things were the same: the seriousness, the curiosity, the capacity for absolute stubbornness on a chosen point that both children had inherited in equal measure from their mother. Where Thomas loved the animals and the land work, Margaret loved the books and the figures, and by the time she was 3 she was sitting at the kitchen table with Adelaide's old ledgers as though they were picture books, which meant, Adelaide told Jonas, that she was going to be exactly as troublesome to anyone who tried to limit her as Adelaide herself had been. Jonas, who found both of his children an endless source of wonder and amusement, said that he considered this an extremely good outcome. Old Clem died in the spring of 1888, quietly in his sleep, which was the right way for a man like Clem to go, and Adelaide and Jonas buried him on the ranch under a cedar tree he had always liked to sit against. Adelaide put flowers on the grave, the same wildflowers that ran along the creek in spring, blue and purple against the limestone, and stood there for a while after the others had gone back to the work of the day, remembering Clem's easy laughter and his bad back and the way he had cried at her wedding, and thinking about all the people who were in the land now, her father and her mother and Clem, and how this was what made a place into a home. Not just the living, but the long accumulation of everyone who had loved it. She was standing there when she heard Jonas's boots in the grass behind her, and he came and stood beside her without speaking, and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stayed like that for a while under the cedar tree with the spring coming all around them. The years moved the way years do when they are full years, quickly in retrospect and richly in the living of them. Thomas turned 8 and then 9 and then 10. Spending his summers following Jonas on the ranch work, and absorbing the knowledge of it with the thoroughness Adelaide had always brought to her own learning. Margaret turned 5 and started demanding access to the school in Dusty Creek, which she attended with a determination that wore out 2 teachers in 3 years, both of whom were good people who had simply underestimated what they were dealing with. Jonas in those years was the steady center of the ranch in the way that some men are the steady center of a thing without making much noise about it, present and reliable and possessed of good judgment. And Adelaide looked at him across supper tables and across pastures and in the warm dark of their bedroom, and felt the deep, particular satisfaction of a life shared with someone who was exactly the right person to share it with. This was not a feeling she had expected when she was 23 with a hammer in her hand and a nail between her teeth. It was a feeling she was grateful for in a way that was so continuous it had become part of the texture of everything. In the fall of 1890, Jonas came in from the north pasture one evening with a thoughtful look on his face that Adelaide recognized as the precursor to something he had been considering for a while and had decided to bring forward. "There is a piece of land come available," he said at supper, after the children were in bed. 40 acres along the North Creek, the Hendricks property. Hendricks is moving his family to San Antonio and the price is fair. Adelaide looked at him. "You want to expand?" "I think we should consider it," Jonas said. "The North Pasture needs better access to water in the summer months. The creek on the Hendricks land would solve that and give us room for a larger herd." Adelaide thought about it, the ledger numbers running through her mind in the easy automatic way they did when she was considering a decision, the costs and the income and the reserves and the margin. She thought about the North Pasture and the water situation in July and August, which had been a quiet problem for several years. "I think you are right," she said. "Let us go look at it Sunday." They went Sunday, riding out together on a clear October morning while Bert watched the children, and they rode the Hendricks land together the way they had ridden their own land 100 times, measuring it with eyes and knowledge. And Adelaide came back satisfied that it was worth doing, and Jonas came back having already thought through the first season's management plan. They bought the land in November and began the integration of it into the ranch's operation the following spring. It was the right decision. The additional water access made the difference in 2 consecutive dry summers, 1891 and 1892, when the main ranch's water sources were under strain and the North Creek held steady. The herd grew. The operation grew with it. Adelaide added another hand in 1892, a young man named Pedro who had worked on a large operation near Del Rio and knew more about horses than anyone Adelaide had ever met, and who became in short order an invaluable part of the ranch's daily life. Thomas, at 12, was already a skilled rider and developing real competence with the cattle, and Adelaide watched him work alongside Jonas in the evenings from the porch with a feeling that was made up of many things: pride and love, and the deep satisfaction of watching something good continue itself. Thomas and Jonas had the easy companionship of a father and son who have spent their years together in real work, who know each other's rhythms and silences, and can operate together without many words. Adelaide thought about her own father, and about what it had meant to grow up alongside him on this land, and she understood Thomas's face when he came in at the end of a day's work, the particular tired contentment of a person who has done something real and true. Margaret, at 6, was already demonstrating that the trouble she was going to cause was going to be the very best kind of trouble. She could read with fluency beyond her years and had an opinion about everything she read, which she shared without restraint. She had her grandmother's habit of reading the weather and her mother's habit of reading people, and Jonas said sometimes in the evenings that he thought Margaret was going to do something extraordinary with her life, and he looked forward to seeing what it was, which he said with the absolute certainty of a man who had watched Adelaide save her own inheritance with nothing more than the truth, and understood what women with that particular combination of intelligence and will were capable of. By 1893, the ranch was a firmly established operation in the hill country, known to its neighbors and to the buyers and to the bank in Dusty Creek as a well-run and solvent enterprise. Adelaide was 34 years old, which was not old, but was old enough to have accumulated a kind of authority that came from having done hard things and come out the other side of them with her judgment intact. Jonas was 38, lean and weathered and still possessed of that rare laugh and the creekwater eyes, and when Adelaide looked at him, she still found the same things she had found in the early spring of 1883, the steadiness and the directness and the willingness to stand in a courthouse and disagree with injustice on her behalf, but layered now with all the years. With all the mornings and the evenings and the arguments and the decisions and the children and the grief of Clem's death, and the satisfaction of the expanded north pasture, and everything else that makes up a life built with someone. She loved him with the specific depth that comes from a decade of genuine daily knowledge of a person, which is a different kind of love from the trembling early kind, not lesser, but richer, fuller, with more rooms in it. It was a Sunday afternoon in October of 1893, with the hill country going gold and orange the way it does in the fall, and the children playing in the ranch yard below. Thomas at 13, practicing his roping on a fence, post with Pedro watching and correcting, and Margaret at 9 sitting on the porch railing reading a book, and occasionally making commentary about Thomas's technique that Thomas received with the resigned patience of an older sibling. That Adelaide and Jonas sat on the porch with coffee and watched it all and did not say very much for a while. "Do you remember the gate?" Jonas said. Adelaide looked at him. "The fence gate, the morning you came." "The first morning," Jonas said. "You had a hammer and a nail between your teeth and you looked at me like you were deciding something." "I was deciding something," Adelaide said. "What did you decide?" "I decided," Adelaide said, "that you had an honest face and that you looked like someone who understood what it meant to work." "That was all," Jonas said, and there was the beginning of the laugh in the corner of his mouth. "That was sufficient," Adelaide said. "At the time." Jonas looked at her with that look, the one that had not changed in 10 years, plain and sure and entirely hers. "And now," he said. Adelaide looked at him in the October afternoon, with the gold light on his face and the sound of their children below them, and the ranch spreading out in every direction around them, every acre of it known and loved and hard-won and theirs. "Now," she said, "I think I made the best decision of my life." Jonas reached over and took her hand on the porch rail, the way he had taken it on their wedding day, and they sat like that while Thomas landed his first clean rope throw, and Margaret looked up from her book to deliver a comment about it that made Pedro laugh and Thomas groan, and the October sun came warm across the hill country, and the ranch breathed around them easy and alive. The following spring Adelaide found herself thinking about the letter her father had written, the one that had sat on Frederick Hull's table and been read aloud in the courthouse on that November morning 11 years before. She had kept it, in the leather satchel with the deeds and the ledgers, and she took it out sometimes, not often, but on certain occasions when she wanted to feel the weight of what had led to everything else. She took it out on a Tuesday in April 1894 when the bluebonnets were running along the creek, and Thomas was out with Jonas working the cattle and Margaret was at school in Dusty Creek, and the ranch house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet when everyone was somewhere else. She sat at the kitchen table where she had sat so many times, the table where her father had drunk his morning coffee, and she read the letter again. Her father's handwriting, careful and precise. His voice in it, measured and certain, the voice of a man who knew what he wanted and had put it down in the plain words of a man who did not believe in ornament. He had intended this land to be hers. He had always intended it. He had said so in his own hand 3 years before he died, and he had held her hand at the end and said it again, and he had been right to believe her capable of it. She had been capable of it. She had proven it, not in the courtroom, though she had proven it there too, but in the 11 years of daily work and decision and growth since then. She had taken what her father built and she had made it more, not by abandoning what he had built, but by understanding it well enough to extend it. And she had done this with Jonas beside her, which was something Thomas Garner had not planned for but which she thought he would have approved of if he had been able to know Jonas, because her father had always been a man who valued honesty and steadiness above most things, and Jonas was both of those things in abundance. She folded the letter carefully along its old folds and put it back in the satchel, and set the satchel in the drawer where it lived, and she went outside into the April morning. The bluebonnets were brilliant along the lower creek, blue and purple in the sunlight, and the cattle were moving across the middle pasture, and somewhere in the north pasture she could hear the distant sound of Jonas's voice and Thomas's answer. Above the limestone hills the sky was the deep clear blue of a Texas spring morning, cloudless, immense, generous. Adelaide stood in the ranch yard with her hands at her sides, and her face turned up toward it and breathed it all in, and the life she had fought for and built and loved was present and complete and real all around her. She was 35 years old and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Jonas and Thomas came back in at noon, dusty and hungry, Thomas having grown 4 inches since Christmas and requiring feeding at regular intervals that strained the household's resources, in a way that Adelaide and Jonas joked about with the easy humor of people who have been joking together about the same things for years. They washed up at the pump in the yard and came to the kitchen table where Adelaide had set out bread and cold meat and the coffee, and Jonas sat down and looked at her across the table with the familiar look, and she smiled back at him with the familiar smile, and Thomas ate with the focused efficiency of a boy who takes feeding seriously. "Good morning out there," Adelaide asked. "Good," Jonas said. "The north herd is looking strong. 3 new calves since Tuesday, all of them healthy. Pedro says the bay mare might foal next week," Thomas offered. "I know," Adelaide said. "I have been watching her." Thomas looked between his parents in the manner of a child who has grown up watching 2 people run a thing together and understands, without being able to articulate it precisely, that they work very well together in a way that not all people work together. "Can I be there when she foals?" he asked. "If it happens at a reasonable hour," Adelaide said. "And if it doesn't happen at a reasonable hour," Thomas pressed. "Then you will hear about it in the morning," Adelaide said firmly. Thomas looked at Jonas for support. Jonas, wisely, found something interesting to look at in the middle distance. Margaret came home from school that afternoon with a composition she had written about the history of the Texas Hill Country, which her teacher had marked with high praise, and a suggestion that Margaret consider further education when she was of age. Adelaide read it at the kitchen table while Jonas read over her shoulder, and the composition was good, genuinely good, observant and precise, and full of a quality of attention to the subject that made Adelaide think of her father and his careful hand. And she felt the same fullness in her chest that she felt looking at Thomas with the cattle, the sense of something continuing and growing and carrying forward. "She is remarkable," Jonas said quietly, so Margaret would not hear, Margaret being in the yard playing with the ranch dog and not requiring more commentary from adults than was already forthcoming. "She is," Adelaide agreed. "She gets it from her father." Jonas looked at her. "She gets it from her mother," he said. Adelaide considered arguing and decided not to. "She gets it from both of us," she said. "That is the best possible thing she could get it from," Jonas said. They sat at the kitchen table in the April afternoon, the 2 of them, with the sound of Margaret in the yard and Thomas coming in from the barn and the coffee going cold between them, and the ranch all around them in the late light, and it was ordinary and complete and exactly right. The last time Adelaide visited the courthouse in Dusty Creek was in 1895, when she needed to register the title to the new Northern Pasture edition, a second parcel they had added in 1894 when the neighboring property became available. She went alone, a Tuesday morning in March, and she walked through the same limestone building with the creaking wooden floor and the pale light through the windows, and she filed her paperwork with the clerk, a young man she did not know who had replaced the older clerk from the previous decade, and he stamped the documents and returned her copies with the brisk efficiency of someone who did this 30 times a week. She stood in the courthouse for a moment before she left, looking at the bench where Judge Clement Ware had sat on that November morning 13 years ago, now occupied by a different judge for a different case. She thought about the look on Raymond Garner's face when the ruling went against him, and she thought about Chester Pratt's damp collar and his merciless precision, and she thought about Jonas standing up from the gallery and saying he respectfully disagreed, and she felt, not triumph, not quite, but something adjacent to it that was warmer and more forgiving, a gratitude perhaps, for the way things had moved, for the slight opening in the law that had allowed for Jonas's testimony, for the judge who had been willing to hear it, for the truth being strong enough to hold its shape under pressure. She was the owner of the Garner Ranch by right and by deed, and by 11 years of daily proof, and she walked out of the courthouse and into the March morning and got on her horse and rode home. The road home ran through the edge of Dusty Creek, and then out along the creek bottom where the last of the winter grass was going brown, but the first of the new growth was showing at the edges, and then up through the cedar breaks to the limestone ridge where you came over the top, and the ranch was laid out below you. The house and the barn and the corrals and the cattle in the middle pasture, and the new section along the North Creek, all of it in the March light under the wide Texas sky. Adelaide stopped her horse on the ridge the way she had stopped it 100 times, to look. Below her in the yard, she could see Jonas at the corral fence, working with one of the young horses. She could see Margaret sitting on the porch step with a book, which was where Margaret could reliably be found when she was not at school or being required to be somewhere else. Thomas would be somewhere in the north pasture, or possibly in the barn with Pedro, and the ranch was alive in its daily way, purposeful and real and rooted in the ground. She sat on the ridge for a while longer than she needed to, looking at it, the way she had stood at the gate with a hammer and a nail and looked at the land the morning her father died, and the way she had stood on the courthouse steps and felt the solid warmth of a right thing having been preserved. Then she turned her horse down the ridge toward home. Jonas saw her coming across the lower pasture, and he raised a hand from the corral fence, and she raised a hand back, and she could see even from the distance that he was smiling, the way you can tell these things about people you have known for 13 years, the angle of the face and the set of the shoulders, and she nudged her horse into a canter, because there was no reason to take the long way when the thing you were riding toward was everything you had ever wanted. She came through the gate and Jonas came to meet her and held her horse while she swung down, and he kept his hand on the reins but his eyes on her face in the way he had of making her feel that the rest of the world was a secondary concern. "How was town?" he said. "Straightforward," she said. "The deed is registered. The north parcel is ours clean." Jonas nodded. "Good." Margaret looked up from her book on the porch step. "Was Mr. Ellison in town?" she called. Mr. Ellison was the bookseller who sometimes had new arrivals. "I did not stop," Adelaide said. "I will go again Friday and ask." Margaret considered this and returned to her book with the look of someone who has accepted a conditional promise. Jonas was still looking at Adelaide with that look. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I am just glad you are home." Adelaide looked at him in the afternoon light. This man she had chosen and been chosen by. This man who had stood up in a courtroom for her because it was true, and because someone needed to say it. This man who had spent 12 years building a life on her father's land alongside her, who had held her hand at the gate on their wedding day, and held it still in the evenings on the porch, and held it in every other way that mattered. "So am I," she said. She took the reins back and led the horse toward the barn, and Jonas walked beside her. And behind them Margaret turned a page, and somewhere in the north pasture Thomas was doing the work, and the cedar trees moved in the March wind, and the Garner Ranch, Thomas Garner's 30 years and Adelaide Garner's 14 years and Jonas Hale's 12 years altogether, spread out under the wide Texas sky, certain and alive and entirely theirs. It was in the winter of 1895, on a cold January evening with the children asleep and the fire good in the stove, that Jonas and Adelaide sat at the kitchen table after supper, and Jonas took out a piece of paper and a pen, and they began to write down what they intended for the ranch, who it should go to, and how, careful and precise in both their hands. Witnessed the following day by Frederick Hull, who was still practicing and still too fond of rye whiskey, but remained genuinely glad to see Adelaide whenever she came through his office door. They made 2 copies and filed them properly, and had them witnessed and notarized and done in every legal way that Thomas Garner's letter had not been done, because they had learned from what that absence had cost, and because they intended that Thomas and Margaret would inherit without dispute or uncertainty the thing that their parents had built together. The documents named both children equally, Thomas and Margaret Hale, joint inheritors of the Garner ranch in all its acreage and all its stock and all its improvements, with the plain and legal statement that the capacity and fitness of the inheritors was not in question and had never been. Adelaide signed her name at the bottom in her steady, precise hand, and Jonas signed beside it, and Frederick Hull witnessed it and stamped it, and it was done. They rode home in the late afternoon through the cedar breaks and over the limestone ridge, and the January sky was very clear and very cold, and the land was winter-brown and still, and the ranch below them was lit by the low sun in a long, warm gold. Adelaide looked at it the way she always looked at it from this ridge, the way she had looked at it the afternoon she came back from the courthouse with her ownership finally clean on paper, the way she looked at it every evening coming home, the way she suspected she would look at it every time she crested this ridge for the rest of her life. "You know," Jonas said beside her, "your father would have liked all of this." "I know," Adelaide said. "I think about that." "What do you think he would have said?" Adelaide considered. She could hear her father's voice very clearly, his careful, measured way of saying things, the way he had held her hand at the end and told her the land was hers. "I think he would have said," she told Jonas, "that it turned out better than he had planned." Jonas looked at her with the warmth of someone who has had 13 years to perfect the particular look he gives this particular person. "He planned pretty well," Jonas said. "He did," Adelaide agreed. "He just did not know about you." Jonas laughed, the full open laugh that she had been producing in him since the first winter, and she smiled at the sound of it. And they turned their horses down the ridge toward the lit windows of the house, and the sound of their children, and the warmth of the life they had made together on the land her father had given her, and she had kept. The smoke rose from the chimney into the cold January sky. The cedar trees stood dark and still. Below them the ranch was alive with its ordinary evening sounds, the cattle settling, the horses in the barn, the faint light through the kitchen window where supper would be warming and Margaret would be reading and Thomas would be managing the complaints of his stomach with his usual focus. Adelaide Garner Hale, at 36, rode down toward all of it with the full and certain happiness of a woman who knows exactly where she is and exactly how she got there, and would not change a single morning of it. And Jonas rode beside her, as he had been riding beside her for 12 years, steady and sure and entirely present, the man who had stood up when no one asked him to and said he disagreed, and had been right, and had never once been sorry, and who would ride beside her on this ridge through every winter and every spring for as many years as the country gave them, on the land that was theirs, under the wide and generous Texas sky.